I'd like to remind you that for more Microsoft webcasts, you can go to microsoft.com/webcast. Thanks again for joining us for today's presentation, Calling WCF Services with Ajax. Now it's my pleasure to introduce today's presenter, Rob Bagby. Rob, you now have the floor.
Thanks, Colleen. Colleen and I had an agreement that I wasn't going to force her to read the entire Calling Windows Communications Foundation Services with ASP.NET Ajax Client Libraries title, so we shortened it up a little bit. This is going to be a good webcast today. I actually see one of the attendees is a good friend of mine, Nima, and I just want to give a shout out to you. Nima used to be on our team and was a heck of a developer evangelist, and so glad to see you out there. Well, I'm just going to jump in, and we're going to just jump right into it. We've got a lot to discuss. As you can tell from the intro slide, let me go back to that intro slide briefly. As you can tell from the slide, this is part 1 of 2. We're going to go as far as we can today, and then we'll finish up next Tuesday with the rest. So the agenda you're going to see in a second is the agenda for both sessions, and we'll get about as far as we can while effectively illustrating how to take advantage of WCF within the ASP.NET Ajax client libraries. So as Colleen said, my name is Rob Bagby. I'm a developer evangelist for Microsoft. What you'll see here is my email address, rob.bagby@microsoft.com, and my blog, www.robbagby.com. If you're interested in Ajax, specifically the Ajax client libraries, I've done quite a bit of blogging on those libraries, as well as I've done 10 webcasts in the past, really discussing every aspect of our client libraries. So you can get a reference to or links out to all of those webcasts on one of my postings out at robbagby.com. Let's take a look at the 2-day agenda here. First thing we're going to do, if you're not familiar with WCF, a lot of folks have been working with Ajax or familiar with how to communicate with ASMIX services. And I actually did a webcast on that and kind of dug deep in how that all works. What we're going to do to start off the day here is to talk about WCF just outside of Ajax. I'm going to give you a high level or 50,000-foot view how it works. We'll do a demo, create a WCF service, and then we'll kind of start moving beyond that. When we're building this first service, we'll actually be building a SOAP service. And the next thing we're going to do is walk through and discuss the differences between SOAP as well as REST. So I'll introduce the concept of REST if you're not familiar with it, which is a representational state transfer. And I'll kind of compare and contrast REST and SOAP briefly. And then we'll run in and show some demos. We'll use Fiddler and we'll start splunking around and taking a look and seeing what the differences are between the two technologies. And I'll make the case or the point that there's a place for both REST as well as SOAP in most solutions, and it's not an either-or. Next, I'm going to just show you the web HTTP binding. That's a new binding that shipped with Framework, or will be shipping with Framework 3.5, or the framework that's in the Orcus release. So when Framework 3.5 comes out, we have a new binding called web HTTP binding, and this is the binding that gives us that ability to expose in a very easy manner RESTful services. So once we've introduced REST, we'll see how the web HTTP binding provides the functionality to expose RESTful services or RESTful endpoints. And we'll beyond that, we'll start walking through and illustrate to you some of the really Ajax-specific functionality within that binding. And so we'll actually see how we are able to utilize that binding to automatically generate client proxies for us that Ajax can communicate with by simply adding an endpoint behavior. So we'll run through a demo. We'll write some code to actually consume one of our WCF services within Ajax, and we'll describe kind of how the round trip is working. And we're going to talk about configuration. I'll have already touched on configuration. Really what we're going to show you, or I'll illustrate to you, is how we can have a no-config deployment. And we actually have a factory that allows us to essentially deploy a service without any configuration file. Obviously, you don't have the same degree of flexibility, but the ease of use is way up there. So I'll illustrate that. That may be about where we're ending for the day, or maybe not, depending where we get. The next section we'll talk about WebGet versus WebInvoke, and essentially these are just a couple attributes that allow us to annotate our operations to essentially say, do we want to do a get or do we want to do some other action, be it a post, a put, or a delete. And we'll run through some demos of that. We're going to talk about the Uniform Resource Identifier templates, or URI templates. And this is really a very cool functionality that you're going to see, specifically with the web get, that allows us to define these templates to essentially build out a pattern URL to allow us to really expose the REST endpoint in really the truest sense of the term REST, and we'll get into that a little bit in that session. Then we'll talk about how we can change the response formats, so how we can kind of iterate between the varying supported response formats being JSON or XML, and I'll show you some use cases of both. And then we'll talk about just briefly compare and contrast the WCF implementation and the ASMIX implementation. And then probably the coolest thing we're going to do is I'm going to introduce Astoria services, if you're not familiar with what Astoria is, as well as how to consume Astoria services within AJAX or ASP.NET AJAX. And I'm afraid I'm not going to ruin my own surprise by introducing the topic any further. You're going to have to tune in tomorrow to get into, or next week to get into that. But I've got some really cool demos on how to consume Astoria services. So with that, let's jump in and kind of start with our WCF overview. So if you're familiar with writing services in the past, prior to 3.0, WCF came out with Framework 3.0, which shipped at the time of Vista. If you're familiar with building services in the past, the challenge that we had was each of the APIs that you used was vastly different from any other API. So if you used CommPlus, that was different than ASMIX, which was different than our WYSI3, which was different than our MSMQ, which was different than remoting. And if you were an expert at any one of those technologies, it didn't mean that you had any working knowledge of how to use one of the other APIs. So the example I typically give is if I've written my service as an ASMIX service and for whatever reason I want to expose that service now over TCP, in no way does my knowledge of how to write an effective ASMIX service help me expose that service over HTTP, or over TCP rather. That was the challenge that we had. Well, that's essentially the strength, if you will, of WCF. The goal of WCF was to provide this unified API that allows you to essentially write your service and then define later how you're going to expose that service. So it's a true separation between the service implementation and then how that service is being exposed over what encodings, over what transports, etc., other decisions. Those can be pushed off till a later time. And you can actually expose a single service over multiple endpoints. And that's the strength. So WC allows you to expose services over HTTP or named pipes or TCP or message queue, all in very similar fashions, as well as allows us to choose between the appropriate encoding, be it text or binary. Now, obviously, you have to choose an encoding that is supported within your transport, but as we'll see, the configuration is relatively simple. So when you talk about WCF, you typically talk about the ABCs. I reverse those to be the CBAs because I think it's more appropriate order. When I said we had a complete split between the service implementation or the capabilities of what the service is, and then how I decide to expose it, if you take a look at the contract, or the C, that defines the capabilities of the service. And so we can write this contract outside of, without any regard to how we're going to expose it later. And that's the separation. So the contract, if you're a typical geek like me, contract has always meant interface. And it's really the same thing in WCF. The interface is, however, decorated with an attribute that allows the WCF infrastructure to know that this interface contains operations that are to be exposed as services. And that's important because WCF is really an opt-in technology, meaning that we don't expose anything or do anything without first having the coder opt into it. So you have to explicitly state that you want to be involved in whatever we're going to do, and we'll see that throughout the demos. So the C is really just the interface that's decorated with the appropriate attribute. The B, the binding, is kind of where it starts getting really interesting. If you think about a binding is essentially a collection of channels, and we'll see that in a second, what that looks like. But you can think of these channels as independent decisions of what you want, of the behavior of your service. One of those channels within this channel stack is going to be the last one, in fact, always has to be the transport. So be it HTTP or named pipes or TCP or whatever. But you have a series of other choices that you want to make within your service. And so some of those other choices, maybe what am I encoding, or do I want to flow a transaction with me, et cetera, et cetera. Or in our case, within Ajax, we may have the need to generate a client-side proxy, and that will be represented as a channel as well. So the binding really encompasses that channel stack, as well as defines what we'll get to the endpoint in a minute. But the binding you can view as kind of this stack of channels or decisions of what we're going to be accomplishing. And lastly, the address is just how do I get to it? So from the Ajax perspective, what we really care about, what's the HTTP endpoint? How do I get to this via HTTP? What's the URL? Okay, so relatively simple. So sending a message in WCF. I'm just going to go ahead and build this whole slide out, and hopefully we'll get to the end here. Okay, so what you see is up on the client, one of the key concepts in WCF is that it's interception-based, or another way of describing that is the client doesn't talk directly with the service. The client talks to this proxy, so it's intercepted, and we walk through this channel stack. And all of the decisions that we made within that binding are now walked through one by one, channel by channel, with that last channel being the transport channel, which is going to send our message over to the service. Now we actually walk through that channel stack in reverse on the service side until we actually get up to the dispatcher and create the stack frame, which defines the envelope or the actual payload of our service. So you can think of it this way. From the client perspective, we need to make a call over to our service. And so we're going to be defining the arguments to our service, and we're going to walk through and probably walk through some sort of serialization mechanism, which we'll see later, to allow us to serialize those parameters that were to our method or service, if you will, that are going to get sent across over to the service side. Once we get to the service side, we're then going to take those parameters that were marshaled, and we're going to deserialize those into a nice .NET stack frame. We're going to call our service. We're going to get a response back in the .NET type, and then we're going to have to walk through the process in reverse. So it's a relatively simple process. This slide is pretty good at illustrating exactly how it all fits together. So let's just jump in and do a demo, and we'll build a service out from scratch here. And then hopefully that should demystify everything we're doing. So I'm going to open up Visual Studio 2008 Beta 2, codename Orcus, which if you're not familiar with Orcus, Orcus is really two things. One of them is Visual Studio 2008, and the other is .NET Framework 3.5, which is giving us the web HTTP binding we're going to see in just a minute. So I'm going to go ahead and just choose a website. And I'm going to do an ASP.NET website, and I'll leave it as an HTTP website, and I'm just going to call this Ajax WCF Webcast Sample. And click OK. And we're just going to build out this website. So you're going to get a little bonus here. We're going to make this service a little bit cooler than most of the sample services you've seen. I'm just going to use a little link to, if you're not familiar with link, I'm going to use link and link to SQL to actually make a call down to my database, and I'm doing that because it's a very fast and efficient means for me to add that code in. So the first thing I want to do is just go ahead and add a link to SQL class. And so I'm just going to right-click here, choose Add New Item, and link is also part of Framework 3.5. And so we're really jumping in and showing off some Framework 3.5 stuff. But you should see how easy it is for us to essentially implement LINQ to SQL. And I'm going to hit this database called Coho, which is the Coho Winery. And all I'm doing is adding this LINQ to SQL class, which is going to now bring up a designer for me, which is going to allow me to just simply drag and drop some of my some tables from my Server Explorer. So let me flip over to Server Explorer. You see I've got this nice designer here. I'm going to go over to my Coho database. And I'm just going to grab a couple tables here that we're going to mess around with. And let me just grab a few of these things and drag them over. And you'll see that essentially within LINQ to SQL, we're getting this a very simple mapping between these objects and the tables on the back end. And now I'm able to actually communicate to my database via this object layer. So one simple example of the difference between the object as well as versus the database is that my object's name is wine, where the actual table is wines. And you're going to have to trust me, because this isn't a LINQ session, that there's a very simple mapping that goes between these objects. Well, now I've got enough done within LINQ for me to actually write some code and to fetch the appropriate data that I want. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a service. So I'm going to add a WCF service. We're just going to add a regular plain vanilla WCF service for this case. We're not going to get into the web HTTP binding yet. So let me see if I can find that template. There's WCF service. I'm going to call this product service. And click add. As you can tell, hopefully this the rest of the hour is going to be mainly demos. So we're just going to walk through and just write code and see how all this stuff works and interrelates. So what I got here was a couple files built out for me. I got an SVC file, which is really a pointer. You can think of it like an ASMIX file if you're used to those, that points out to the service and points to my code behind as well. And so it shows me my code behind is in productservice.cs. Now, all of the real work is in product service and iProductService.cs. So you remember I said the C in WCF was contract. Well, here's my interface, and it's decorated with the service contract. And all that really means is that it's telling WCF that any operation inside of this interface that is decorated with an operation contract is an operation that we want to expose via WCF or expose it as a service. And so we've got one method here, one operation that's being exposed called do work. We're going to get rid of that in a second, and we're going to create our own. So let's go over here to the implementation side, and you'll see that I've just got a class product service that implements iProduct service. There's nothing in here that defines really how it's being transported or any way it's being exposed. Likewise, over here we have no information in here on how we're exposing it. And that's the key to WCF. That's the power, if you will. Let's go in and let's make a pretty cool example here. In order for me to make this thing go, I need to start importing a couple namespaces. So I'm going to be using system.data, using system.link. I'm going to be using system.data.link. And then I think that's pretty good. And so let me go ahead and do this. I'm going to add what I'm going to do in this query is I'm going to select some information about a wine, and I'm going to return a collection of wines. So I've got my system.collections.generic, so that's cool. Let me do a public and class, and I'm just going to generate a type that we're going to use as our response, because I want to illustrate to you a more complex example of us having a .NET type that we're crafting up here and having that marshaled over to our client-side world in AJAX, which is JavaScript. So let's go ahead and create this class, and we'll call it wine result. And then I'm going to add a couple property field combos. And here's another Framework 3.5ism where we've got this auto-implemented property. And this takes the place of the construct where I might have had a field and an empty property as an empty getter setter, other than just reading and writing to that field. We can take care of that with this auto-implemented property, and that's fine. So I'm just going to call it short wine name. And then let's do another auto-implemented property, and I'm going to call this wine label URL. And this is going to be the type that I'm going to transport from my service. So my service is going to return a collection of these wine results. So let me go ahead back over to the interface, and let's change this to, let's do a list of wine result, and we'll call this Get Wines, and we'll take in an int page number. And in this case, we're just going to allow us to get back a collection of wines by page. So we'll do some server-side paging here just to make this even cooler and even more potent of an example. So you see what we've got here. We've got one operation that we want to expose that returns a generic collection of wine results. The operation's name is Get Wines, and it takes in an integer representing the page number. Simple paging, we're all familiar with how that works. So let's go back over here, and let me just delete that, and we can just go ahead and use let Visual Studio implement our interface for us. And you'll see we now have our method out here. Clean it up a little bit. Give me a little room so you guys can kind of see what I'm doing. And I'll untether these over here, and you can see the full screen now. And you'll see we just have our simple implementation here, and it just throws in an error by default. Now what we want to do is return this wine result class. And so earlier I talked to you that WCF is an opt-in technology. Well, if you're familiar with how the ASMIC services worked, by default they use the XML serializer, which had its challenges in that the XML serializer only serialized public. Anything public was going to get serialized, which caused some problems if you wanted to have some properties that were public but you didn't want to marshal them across the wire. A simple example would be an image or something like that. You don't want to send that over the internet, but you may have wanted to have that locally exposed, or in some scenarios exposed. One of the cool things, as I stated earlier in WCF, we're opt-in by default. And so we use a different serializer now called the Data Contract Serializer. And that came out in Framework 3.0. And the Data Contract Serializer essentially states that you have to actively decorate each class as well as attribute, or a property or field with an attribute to define whether you want it to be marshaled or to be serialized. And so we're going to just simply decorate this thing with the data contract attribute, and each of these guys we're going to decorate with a data member attribute. And so we're actively opting in that we want to serialize these two field property combos. And so that's cool. So now we're ready to be able to send out our wine result. And so we can just start writing some code. Well, in Link to SQL, the first thing we have to do is create an instance of our Coho data context. So we created this, you remember we created this Coho Link to SQL class. What they did was they built a nice data context for us, strongly typed, that's going to allow us to essentially, it's going to allow us to very easily communicate to our database via that nice object layer. And so we're going to use Link to talk to it. So let's write a Link query. So we'll do var wines equals from W in Coho dot wines, and then let's do order by. We'll do a very simple query, W.short wine name, and this will help us in our paging with a nice defaulted order by. And let's just select a new wine result. And here we'll just do short wine name equals, and then we'll do W.short wine name. And then let's grab our wine label URL equals W.wine label URL. And we're done here. And so now we can actually implement our paging. So I'm just going to do this the simple way. I'm going to do return wines.skip. And here I'm just going to tell it how much to skip. And what I'm going to do is just take the page number. I'm going to multiply that. I want my pages to be 6 wine labels per page. And so I'll do page number times 6 dot take. And again, you'll have to trust me here that we're actually doing a very nice server-side paging here. And when the query that gets resulted, or the resulting query here, is actually using the row number as well as the top statement to do an appropriate server-side paging functionality here, all thanks to the Link to SQL assemblies or assembly. So I've got my service here. My service is built. Let me just Control-Shift-B to compile, make sure everything works. Give my laptop a second to catch up with me. And my build succeeded, so my service is working and running. And so let's just kind of take a look at one last class. We took a look at the I, or the interface, which is the C, which essentially the C of the C, B, and A. It just says, what is it that my service does? Let's take a look at the configuration here. So I'm going to open up my web.config, and we'll see where those decisions were made on how I want to expose this service. So I'm going to go down here to the bottom, excuse the scrolling, and you're going to see this node called system.service-model. That is the WCF root node in your web.config or your app.config configuration. And what you're going to see here is I have this service. Let me see if I can't clean this up a little bit so we can read it a little better. And so what you're going to see here is I have this service that essentially is exposed, or I've exposed two endpoints within my service. And my service name is product service, and the contract is, unfortunately, it misstates and assumes it put a namespace around it and didn't. So it's a good thing we looked at this. You see the product is product service, and inside of my endpoint we've defined the C, the B, and the A that we talked about earlier. The address is blank because using IIS, the SVC file stands as that address. So the actual HTTP address to the SVC file we saw earlier, this guy right here, that acts as the A. So I can leave the address blank and it'll be fine. And any address I add is going to be appended onto that. And so a /mex will get me to my MEX endpoint. Very briefly, a MEX endpoint allows you to expose the metadata for your service. And so it allows us to do some great things like add service reference, which we'll see in a second. If you don't see a MEX endpoint, somebody else can't go to your SOAP service and essentially fetch the WSDL and understand how to build out the proxy that allows you to communicate with it. So I've got my service here. My endpoint is defined using a WSHTTP binding, which we'll see in a minute. It's pretty interesting. So we're pretty good to go here. Let me just go ahead and build a little simple test app to test our service. And so I'm just going to right-click here on my solution. I'm going to choose Add. I'm going to choose a new project. And I'm just going to build a console application. So I'm going to call this thing, just call it Test App for now. And all I want to do here is I want to, in my test app, I'm going to set this as a startup project. And next thing I want to do is add a reference to my service. So I'm going to add a service reference, and this is going to walk through that endpoint. So let me go down here and AJAX WCF service webcast, and I think I called this sample, /productservice.svc. If I click go, it's going to go out and actually look for that MEX endpoint and see and pull back essentially all of the metadata about that endpoint. So walking through there, you can see that I actually found my service here, and so I'm able to now create this service reference to it. And I'm just going to call this product service proxy. And this will just define the namespace for my service reference. And so now I can actually write some very simple code. It's going to go through and build some references for me, including system.service-model, which is where WCF exists. But here now I can actually write some code to communicate with that service. And so let me just do that. So let's do call it product service proxy dot product service client, and I think this is proxy equals new, and this the full namespace is test app dot product service proxy. So let me just import that so we can cut down the amount of code here, and then we'll just do this. Okay, so we've got product service client proxy equals new product service client, and now I can actually go through and actually fetch my data. So I can do one result, and you'll see I have this client-side version of that type. So let's do results equals proxy dot get wines, and let's just pass it in a page number of 0, so we'll get back the first page of those wines. Now let's just iterate through our data for each, and let's do wine result, wine in results, dot, or just in results, and now I can just do a console.WriteLine. Console.WriteLine, and here we'll just do, we'll just push out a 0, and then in parentheses, let's do the, we'll do the wine label URL here, just for simplicity's sake, and put a right paren around that, quote, comma, and then let's do W wine dot short wine name and wine dot wine label URL, and then let's do a console.readline at the very end, and let's run this up. What we should see is pushing out to the console all of our wines, 6 wines in fact, because we're doing some server-side paging, and in parentheses the wine label URL, which we do see, and so we're good to go. So we're all set. We got a good example of essentially how we're going to able to get how we're able to essentially write a WCF service as well as consume this service. And as it turns out, after the next section, we're going to actually see that that was a SOAP service. So let me jump back to the slides. And let's kind of continue on here. Hopefully we'll get pretty quickly into the AJAX-ness of where we want to be. So SOAP stands for the Simple Object Access Protocol. So now we're kind of talking about the difference between SOAP and REST. Well, SOAP is a very message-centric construct. You essentially have this SOAP envelope, and within the SOAP body, you are able to pass back and forth your payload, but the schema of SOAP describes the call itself, and you used WSDL to describe the API. The challenge people have had with SOAP in the past is that although it's named Simple Object Access Protocol, it's actually quite complex. The complexity of SOAP allows you to do certain things that you can't do in other more RESTful services. So for instance, we're able to actually do message level encryption, sending messages over HTTP using SOAP. We can do transactions over HTTP using SOAP. These are some really complex tasks that include multiple HTTP calls, and it's a very difficult thing to accomplish, but the SOAP protocol allows you to accomplish this. So you're able to do some really complex things, but the cost is that it's challenging to do, and it's not simple, or it's non-trivial. Now, as we saw earlier, a lot of tooling support gives us the automatic proxies that we can use, but if you lose that tooling support, to actually write anything by hand is quite tedious. Now, on the other side of the world, there's this whole group of people that believe in REST. So you've got this one group of folks that are very SOAP-oriented and say, we should use SOAP to expose all of our services. And so on the other side, you see this group that says, we should be using these what's referred to as a REST service. So their argument is the simpler the better. And the main argument is what's the most influential technology really ever, and what's the most prevalent technology out there, at least software slash hardware. You would argue that's the internet, and the internet essentially works off of 4 HTTP verbs: get, put, post, and delete, and everything is exposed via a URI. So you can get to any asset via URI. Well, that's simplicity, and the argument goes from the REST side is that that's why we essentially, that simplicity is what has made the internet so successful. So they argue if you're going to build services and a services layer that you want to expose, why not use that same technology? Why not use that same architecture that's made the internet so successful? And so you use the 4 HTTP verbs, and you use URIs to essentially address every single one of your resources. And it's a relatively simple theory that we should all feel pretty comfortable with, because that's how the internet works. And the answer, as pretty much always, in my opinion, between what's better, REST or SOAP, lies somewhere in the middle. There are certain things that you want to use SOAP for, and there are certain things you want to use REST for. SOAP, if I need an additional encryption layer, or if I want to attach transactions, or any number of some of the WYSI type functionality, well, SOAP is great. But for consuming simple services via AJAX or Silverlight, REST is typically the answer. And so that's what we're going to see here is the web HTTP binding that we're going to be looking at is actually a RESTful endpoint. So I'm going to just jump in and show you a pretty simple example of REST and SOAP. So what we're going to do is I'm just going to open up something called Fiddler. And Fiddler essentially just attaches itself to WinINet as a proxy and allows me to look at both the request as well as the response. And so we're just going to go ahead and take a look at the request and response of that simple app that we built earlier. And let's go ahead and just close this out, and then we'll go back into Fiddler. And let's just take a look. First of all, what you're going to notice is there were 4 calls here. And I'm not going to dig too deep into why there were 4 calls, but I will explain it to you, is that we're by default using WSHTTP binding, which by default sets up message level encryption. And so if we actually take a look at this call where we passed in a simple integer, this looks quite a bit more complex than just passing a simple integer. And so here's our SOAP envelope, here's our SOAP body. Inside of the body you'll see that we've got a nice cipher value in here. And you shouldn't be able to understand this because it's overtly complex. In fact, this is actually encrypted data going back and forth. But you can see that we are passing over a SOAP message. We've got the SOAP envelope and the SOAP body. And so this is a very good example of a complex SOAP call, but also the advantage that we get out of that given the fact that we're encrypting this message. So let me go ahead and just make this a little bit simpler. And we'll make this example a little simpler by going in and turning off WSHTTP binding. And let's do basic HTTP binding. And this basic HTTP binding is analogous to an ASMIC service. It's the most interoperable HTTP service binding that's available. So I now have that available to me. And now if I go back to my proxy and choose to update the service reference, it's going to go back and rebuild this proxy and understand that we're using the basic HTTP binding. And if we run this thing up again, and go take a look in Fiddler again, close this out, and let's take a look in Fiddler again. Now if we go ahead and take a look, you'll see that this SOAP message is quite a bit more simple, and in fact we're just passing in our page number right here as an integer 0, and we're calling into the getWINES method, and our result is this nice SOAP envelope containing my WINES response, which has the WINE result, which has just a collection of WINE result object, or in this case nodes, which represents the payload. So you can see that although it's simpler than we had when we were using encryption, this is still pretty thick protocol that we're using, and there's some complexity in there that maybe we don't really want to take advantage of when or have to deal with anyways when we're working with ASP.NET AJAX. So we might want to go ahead and essentially use a more RESTful binding. So let's go ahead and change my endpoint to use the web HTTP binding, which is the binding that we're going to be using. Let me just get rid of this MEX endpoint altogether. So I'm going to just use my web HTTP binding. I don't need these service behaviors anymore. So I'm just going to get rid of this. And what I'm going to do is add in an endpoint behavior. And let's do this. Let's do a behavior, and let's set name equal to, we'll just call it custom. And then inside of here, I just want to add a web HTTP endpoint behavior, and I'll demystify that. In the next demo, when we talk a little bit more about the web HTTP binding, the last thing I need to do is set my behavior configuration equal to custom. And now I've exposed this thing as a RESTful service. So let me just go ahead and go back to the code, and we'll go back to my interface here. And what I want to do is, for now, I just want to get rid of this parameter that we're passing. Just to do a very simple example here, I just want to get rid of that. So I'm just going to let me just comment this thing out, and we'll just build another version of this thing without a parameter, and we'll hard code the parameter 0 in there. And we're just doing this just to illustrate REST. We'll get back to the appropriate implementation in a minute. And let me just put this in here and get rid of that. And what we're going to do here is we'll just set int page number equal to 0. We'll just hard code that in here so that the code still works. Now back in my iProduct service, the next thing I want to do is I want to essentially direct this. I essentially want to direct the infrastructure to understand that we're using a web GET here. And so RESTful, when I go to fetch something within a REST architecture, I use a GET. And the way you define or tell your method or your operation that it's a GET is by decorating it with a web GET attribute. And so by simply decorating this with a web GET attribute, I now am exposing this getWines operation as a GET. So let's see how that works. So what I'm going to do is just simply run this thing up into the browser. And of course we've got to clear out my config. So I've got to get rid of this because I deleted that configuration. And let's just run this thing up again. And so everything works. And now if I just simply append a getWines here, you'll see that I'm going to get back this nice result. In this case, an XML representation of my data here by simply just calling a GET. Now, obviously we use a GET because all browsers are GET browsers. And so I just simply by addressing, by simply adding this address or hitting the appropriate URI, I've now managed to fetch the data that I wanted to return in a very simple manner. So this is a very clean example of really the difference between that GET, between the RESTful endpoint and the SOAP endpoint. And if I go back into Fiddler and take a look at this getWines, you'll see that I'm just calling a GET right here. You'll see there's no SOAP envelope in here at all. And my response is just directly at this plain old XML that came back, or what people refer to as POX. So we're not bound by this big, thick SOAP envelope with the SOAP body and all of that and all of that baggage, if you will. So we get this very simple request response. As we go throughout the rest of this presentation today and next Tuesday, you're going to see how we can change this response type and actually pass back things like JSON, which we're really going to want inside of AJAX or ASP.NET AJAX. So let me jump out of here for a minute. Let me close Fiddler all up. And we go back to the slides briefly, and we're going to jump back into a demo in seconds flat. So next thing, the web HTTP binding. I already kind of introduced that to you. This is the binding that's available in 3.5 that gives us that REST-centric, or that some people call it web-centric binding. And what's really cool about web HTTP binding is we have, specifically with regards to AJAX, we have an endpoint behavior called enable web script, which gives us this AJAX-friendly profile. So you saw me using web HTTP earlier. When I added that endpoint behavior, I added web HTTP. Well, if I change that over to enable web script, essentially what I get is I'm still underneath everything else using a web HTTP endpoint behavior, but I get this profile set up that's AJAX friendly, meaning I can do some things like some interesting things like generate a client proxy automatically. Let's jump into that and see how that goes, and this will probably stand as our last demo for the day. And we'll get into the rest of the goodies next week in the rest of the presentation. So here's where we are. We've seen the service. We've seen the service work. We actually were able to fetch it through a web get, and that was pretty cool. What we want to do now is I want to change this over so that I can use this via Ajax, or can consume it in Ajax. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to simply choose Enable Web Script, which is going to allow me to consume this thing in some really interesting manners, including via Ajax. And I get this nice Ajax profile. So I'm just going to save that, and that's really all I need to do here. You'll note that I've got my web HTTP binding set up, my contract is defined, and my behavior is just essentially referencing over to the appropriate behavior, and I don't need to have that address because we're just going to hit that SVC endpoint. So we're in pretty good shape from this standpoint. The next thing I need to do is I'm going to go into my service. I'm going to make some changes to it. And the one change I really want to make, let me jump back and let's re-enable the real service that takes in the integer. And I'm going to get rid of the web get for a minute here. The other thing I want to do up in my service contract is I want to go ahead and set a namespace. And in this case, I'm going to set my namespace equal to, and we'll just do it to URN, and we'll do robbagby/services. And we'll see why this is important in a minute. If you're familiar with ASMIX, the ASMIX service is communicating from Ajax. The way the infrastructure worked when we built our client-side proxy, we used the .NET namespace that surrounded the service to generate the namespace for our proxy. In WCF, we actually used the namespace for our service, or the URN here defined in the service contract. And so theoretically, my proxy should have a robbagby.services namespace surrounding my iProduct service. So that's how we're gonna actually address it and get a reference to it, and I'll show you that in a minute. But this is an important step for us to add in. So I want to make sure it's clean. If I don't do this, I'm going to get the default tempuri.org that you've probably seen in a whole bunch of other scenarios. So I've got my namespace in here. The next thing I need to do is add a class. So let me, or a nice page that we're going to use. I'm going to set this website as my startup project here. And if you don't mind, I'm just going to go ahead and pretty this thing up a little bit by adding just some UI files in here. I'm not going to add any code to this thing, but I've got some UI files that I'm going to drag over to this thing, and I've got them set up for me under my webcasts, and I've got some starter files here. And so I'm just going to drag over my app themes and images, and let me just grab all this stuff and drag it over to my new project. Just drag this up here. And this should allow me to create a prettier version of my site. So we can kind of get a little, a nice looking site's always a happy site. So let me go ahead and I've just added in a couple master pages. I've added in some themes here, and nothing major. I didn't do anything really crazy here. I think I might need to move a couple of these into my app code directory, but we'll figure that out as we go along. Let me go ahead and add a new item. I'm going to add a web form that we're going to use to communicate with my service. And so let me just add a typical web form here, and I'm going to choose to select my master page. I'm just going to call this Photos. We'll call Photo List. And I'm going to choose to use my text page master as my master page. And we should be able to see in split view now in Visual Studio 2008, we get this nice ability to use nested master pages. And I should be able to see, if it catches up with me, a nice view of what my page is going to look like even though I've got a nested master page. That's cool. So everything's working out pretty well so far. Let me do a Control-Shift-B, make sure everything's compiling. I didn't change my service to implement, so let me change this back. I had the older version of that service in there. Let me compile. You'll see build started in the lower left-hand corner, build failed, and that's the guy I need to move over. My cohowinery.nav exists, I believe, in, let's see, is that textpage.master? Coho Winery, that's not it. Give me 1 minute here, maybe my blank. There's nav. So let me move this into app code. Control-Shift-B. And build succeeded. So we're good to go. Let me close up my blank master. We don't need to take a look at that. And we'll close up the web config. We're done there. Bear with me as I try and clean up the real estate a little bit. So now what we've done is essentially I've just created this photo list class. You saw me build my service earlier. Now what I want to do is consume my service. So normally what I would do is add a script manager. Now I already have a script manager defined inside of my master page. So in that case, that's why we created the script manager proxy. So what I'm going to do is just go into Ajax extensions. If you already have a script manager and a master page, you just use the script manager proxy in its stead, because a page can only have one script manager on it. The script manager proxy is going to allow me to register my services. So in order to register that WCF service you saw me create, I just add a services node, an ASP service reference node, and set the path equal to my service file, which is that productservice.svc we saw earlier. So that's all I need to do. If I fire this page up now, let me set photo list as my start page. Let me just run this up into the browser. And when I run it up, I'm going to set debugging to true. When I run this up, what we should see is an empty page that represents my master. But what we're going to see behind the scenes is that this proxy was generated for us, this cool client-side proxy. And let me prove that to you by just doing a view source. And inside of my view source, I'm going to just scroll down here a little bit. Incidentally, you see stuff like this. This is actually an HTTP handler that's registered in your web.config file. And this is an encrypted URL or query string that essentially tells the HTTP handler what embedded resource to fetch. So this line right here, in fact, is fetching out the ASP.NET Ajax client libraries. And you can prove that to yourself by copying this into the URL, into the browser, into the address bar in the browser, and you'll be directed to save that file, and that's actually the client-side ASP.NET Ajax client libraries. So I would suggest that you do that just to play around with it. This guy right here is another set of client libraries we have that gives you some web forms interaction from the client side. And then what you're going to see down here is what the script manager and the script manager proxy, the script manager actually emits it, the proxy tells it to emit this, but this is the client-side proxy that we're going to be using to communicate to our service. So let's just copy this. I'm just hit Control-C, and I'm going to copy this into the address bar. Just replace photo list with that photoservice.svc whack.js debug. And you can see I can now save this thing. And I'm going to save it down to a file on my desktop called proxy1. Let me just overwrite that file. Use the same name over and over again. That way I don't have too many files, phantom files floating around on my box. So let me wait till Visual Studio closes out here, and then we'll just open up proxy1 and take a quick look at it. Let me go back up to my desktop, and let's just scroll up to the top, and there's proxy1, which we just modified. It's 11:52 my time in Phoenix. And you'll see, here's my namespace. So we've created this Ajax client library class with a namespace of robbagdy.services, which was that namespace you saw me generate. Now, if I go down here, we can see somewhere I've got a register class in here. It's sometimes difficult to find, but you can find register class in here. We'll just do. You can find register class, and here's where we're actually registering the class, robbagdy.services.iProductService. So this is going to be the name of the class that we're going to be communicating with. So you can splunk through this and take a look at this code, but essentially it's JavaScript that encapsulates the functionality of talking to our service. And so it's now very easy for us to communicate with that service. And let's see kind of how easy it is. So let me go ahead. I've got a nice code snippet that gives me a nice UI that we can work with. And let me clean this UI up because it's very simple, and I just want to show it to you so you just feel comfortable with it, because it's a very simple UI that I've got here, and I don't want this to infer any complexity, because this is non-complex what we've got. So I've just got two spans, and inside of there I've got two anchors. And when you click the anchor, they either increment or decrement a page num JavaScript variable. And then we call a method called load photos. And this is for my paging, previous and next. Then I've got a div called with an ID of photos. That's as complex as it is. So now what I want to do is just write the code to actually communicate with this thing, or to essentially I'll write the load photos implementation, and we'll go talk to our service to get to those photos. So I'm going to do script type equals, let JavaScript IntelliSense catch up with me, text JavaScript. And yes, you heard me correctly. In Visual Studio 2008, you get JavaScript IntelliSense, and we'll see kind of how that plays out in a minute. So let me just do a function page load, and this will get called by the AJAX infrastructure. And so I'm just going to call load photos here. Now I also need a variable out here for my, I think we called it page num. So I'll do var page num equals 0. We'll default that to 0, so that'll be our paging. And then down here I want to do function load photos. And then inside of here I want to create my proxy. So I'll do var proxy equals new Rob Bagby, and there's the IntelliSense. You see I'm even getting IntelliSense on my proxy that gets dynamically generated for my service. So I'm actually creating an instance of that proxy that represents my service, and now we should see a proxy.getWines. And you do see that getWines, and there's the page number parameter that it's expecting. So we do page num, and then I've got to pass it a callback. And so in this case, I'm going to pass it a callback to, I think it's called photos returned. I've got another code snippet to handle this, so you don't have to see me write a bunch of code to essentially write any HTML back into the DOM. And so you see here's my code, here's my callback method that takes in a result. So the AJAX infrastructure is going to call this callback when the result of my getWines comes back, and it's going to pass it this object, if you will, and it's going to be a JavaScript representation of my .NET type. And you'll see all I really do here is clear out the HTML of that div that we had, and then I just start iterating through my results. And from that result, I write out the wine label URL and the short wine name inside of some HTML. So it's actually pretty simple. And I'll break into this in a second, but let's run this thing up just to see it go and make sure everything's warm and fuzzy. And so there's our callback. Our callback was called, and now this is going to increment that counter, and you can see that we're actually paging through this wine list, making calls over to our WCF service, which has all of the paging logic built into it. So we did some pretty complex operations in a very simple manner. In fact, the AJAX version of this thing was so simple we even got JavaScript IntelliSense to give us the essentially the fully qualified name of our JavaScript proxy, as well as all of the operations that are available from that proxy, as well as the full signature, making it very simple for us to work with. Let me just go ahead and do this, and let's see if we can't sneak a peek at that result. Sometimes Visual Studio will just call it an object, but let's see what we get here. And you'll see if I go ahead and take a look at this result, what I've got is a JavaScript array, which is the closest thing to the generic list of T, and I get back an array of these types, which essentially have the exact same property names as those what was ever decorated as data members as to be marshaled from the data contract serializer. We also have this underscore underscore type, which represents the fully qualified .NET type name. The importance of this is that, as you can probably guess, we are able to create these from the client side in JavaScript, a JavaScript type, using the appropriate naming with this underscore underscore type, pass it down to the server, and the serializer will know how to generate the .NET type from that JavaScript type, which is pretty cool. But hopefully what we've seen here is the simplicity it is to essentially generate or create a WCF service that is consumable via ASP.NET AJAX, as well as to consume that service within ASP.NET AJAX. We'll go through this in some more detail next week in the webcast, as well as we'll walk into some more of the complex areas and show how we can really kind of tweak some knobs and configure that binding in some interesting ways. So with that, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to forward down to the questions, and we're going to hand this back over to Colleen. I think this is the question. Colleen, I'm going to hand it back to you to introduce the survey.
Great. Thanks so much, Rob. Yeah, I just want to encourage everybody to submit any additional questions at this time. And also want to let you know that for previously and upcoming webcasts, please visit Microsoft.com/webcast. And also, if you have any ideas for upcoming webcasts, please follow that link in the fourth bullet point. And now, hopefully you're all seeing a survey slide in your slide area. Please follow the links to fill out the survey. We definitely appreciate your feedback. And with that, I'll hand the floor back over to Rob to address any questions.
Okay, so I'm going to start walking through the question manager, and I'll answer some questions, and then we'll have to go offline in a few minutes. But once we do that, I'll answer the questions within the question manager, so you can hang on, even if we've gone off of audio. So the first question is, where is the source code available? I haven't posted the source code yet, but you'll be able to find it on robbagby.com. And I'm putting that into the question manager, and I will commit to posting that by tomorrow morning. So I'm posting that to everybody. Let's see. When I use IIS, the address was blank. Is this the same if you specify 127.0.0.1? No, the reason why the address was blank, what he's referring to, Tom is referring to, is in my endpoint, where I had the address, the binding, and the contract defined, the address was an empty string. And what that means is in IIS, the way you define the actual endpoint in IIS is with that SVC file. So it's whatever the actual path, the full path to that SVC file stands as your address. So I don't need to enter the address in that endpoint, because that service file is the address. I hope that makes sense. So I'm just going to put that answered in line, or on the phone, and I'll put that post privately. Ryan says, "Wow, agreed." Wow. Chris, let's see. Can you overload functions with WCF? For example, get ones when you wanted to have a no parameter option. I could have created another service, or another operation if I wanted to. I just didn't want to just do Control-C on all the code. So answered phone, and let's see. Since Rust is simple, is it better performance than SOAP? So you have to think about it this way. What is performance? What would be the performance challenges that you have? And within this realm, what you're going to probably see, the biggest drag is going to be on marshaling that data to and fro. And so the SOAP envelope is going to be significantly larger than either a JSON or a plain old XML. So yeah, you would probably see a significant performance increase by marshaling the smaller payload. Specifically, if you looked carefully when I was using the WSHTTP binding, which was the default WCF binding, that was actually doing message level encryption, which if you know much about encryption, you know more than me, but it requires 4 HTTP calls in order to fully encrypt that and send the encrypted message over. There are calls to get short-term tokens and then a longer-term token, and so you're certainly going to eke out better performance than those 4 calls. But on the other side of the coin, that SOAP packet is going to have message level encryption, which you may need. So the answer is yes, you're going to see quite a bit better performance in most cases. So I'm going to put that answered phone. And let's put that post privately. And then, are these demos available for download? Which URL? They will be by tomorrow. And just go out to www.robbagby.com and post all. Now, when you get these demos, you're going to need to make sure you have Visual Studio 2008 Beta 2 or Orcus Beta 2 running, or none of this is going to work for you. Next question. It's a long one, so let me read this. Okay, so the question is, if I set up a service with web HTTP endpoint to be consumed by clients, the message sent is encrypted. That is not correct. The message is not encrypted using web HTTP. It's WSHTTP where it's encrypted. And the one we were showing for the most of the demos today was web HTTP, so it was not encrypted. So the rest of the question, what type of encryption is used, and blah, blah, blah. You can, Chike, if you have additional questions about the WSHTTP binding encryption, you can send me an email to rob.bagby. I'm going to send this in rob.bagby@microsoft.com, and I can forward you an email strand I got from that from the WCF team regarding the encryption, and you can go from there. But I don't want to spend too much time talking about the encryption because that's not really part of what the webcast was today. How can I hide the proxy interface from the JS copy and from just opening the service directly? I'm not quite sure exactly, Chris, what your question is. How can I hide the proxy from the proxy interface from the JS copy and from? I'm not quite sure. I assume that you want to, you fear having this client-side proxy out there and you want to mask that so some other folks can't call into your service. That proxy class is generated for you automatically. If you don't register the service, the proxy class is not going to get generated. So if you don't register it in that service reference, the proxy won't get generated. But you're going to have the same code out there in JavaScript to make a call to it somewhere. So one thing you might choose to do if you wanted to make sure that only, you could put some authentication on those files in IIS7 now on the JavaScript files using the integrated pipeline, and that would mean only those people that have authenticated appropriately are going to be able to get to that JavaScript file, and non-authenticated people can't. That might be one thing that might assuage your fears. I'm not sure. If you have additional questions, fire me an email. And let's see, 2 more questions. Thanks. You're welcome. And let's see. You are using Visual Studio 2008 and Ajax 1.0 JavaScript. How would the code differ in Ajax 1.1? What would change? Really what you're seeing here is there would be no change unless, let's see, from the front-end perspective, you would see no change because most of the heavy lifting is abstracted away from you by that JavaScript proxy. And so if there's a change between the Ajax versions and the WCF binding, all of that needs to be handled within the WCF binding so that it knows the appropriate proxy for you to generate. And so I hope that makes sense. You're more than welcome to send me an email if you want some additional work done or additional research done, Tom. So. And that's it for the questions. So, Colleen, I guess we'll just go offline now, and I'll stay on and answer any subsequent questions for a little while.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot, Rob. And once again, I'd just like to remind everyone to please take a moment and fill out that survey before you exit the session room today. And I'd like to extend a special thank you to Rob for your presentation. That concludes today's live meeting. Thank you all for joining us. You may now disconnect from the audio portion of this event.